I definitely don't remember this thing being available for Norsca's roster in Warhammer 1 and 2, at least in multiplayer. I think it's one of the Monster Hunt monsters, actually, but it now has been officially added to Norsca's roster. What do you get for the Cold Voider? It's essentially just a Frostworm rank 9 Regiment of Renown. It picks up Guardian, which is quite nice for giving your Norscan lords physical resistance. However, my patron Coops here is deciding to Guardian the worst lord in the entire game. That is the Marauder Chieftain. So this guy, I mean, his stats are all right, but only 50 armor on foot. Pretty poor. He's thankfully very cheap. Does have Flaming Axe of Cormac to give himself flaming damage and a little bit of extra non-armor piercing weapon damage. Standard die for a little bit of support as well. He's facing off against what is right now widely considered one of the best lords in the game. He's got Festus. Festus coming in with a Soul Grinder, a couple of Plague Toads, a couple of Plague Knights. Knights with Axe and Shield. Got some Chaos Poison Warhounds backing them up, a couple of Exalted Plague Bearers, and Nurglings up front. A nice, relatively elite Nurgle build here for the rest of Coop's Norskins. He's got Skinwolves, vanguarding with some Horse Masters and Horsemen on the other side. Marauders through the center, Brutes of the Hound, Fire Famir, and then the Cold Voider. So let's watch this thing approach. And, I mean, Frostworms in general are generally considered a meme unit due to the fact that they are not very good, but dragons in general have been buffed, and I do believe that does include the Frostworm for Norsca. It's going to come in here and deliver a breath attack. Doesn't really do too much to Festus, but it does apply Frostbite. Of course, this thing has both Frostbite and Chilling Aura, so it can significantly speed debuff any unit. And while Nurgle as a faction is already pretty slow, it's not like you need a lot of speed debuffs against them. If you do have speed debuffs, you can essentially immobilize many units, given the fact they're already quite slow. But a nice Flaming Sword of Ruin here on the Brutes of the Hound. These other units charging in. The Marauder Champs and the Icehorn Marauders getting absolutely hard collapsed by a bunch of Nurgle mobile units. But while this is happening, Cold Voider goes straight for Festus. Going to get counterattacked here by the Soul Grinder in melee. Should be a decent 2v1 as long as Festus can stay alive. He's got his slow Plague Knights also. Oh man, they're so slow charging in here. They're little one-handed Nurgle axes. They get a nice surround, so they'll try and kind of mass block and allow Festus to get away here if he can, but out in the periphery, it's kind of a mixed bag. Double collapse with the Skinwolves, though, managed to extricate themselves from these flank engagements and just wreck these Knights here. I say wreck these Knights. They're actually not doing much damage at all right now. Just a big blobby mess there, to be honest, but at the very least, Brutes of the Hound do carve up a unit of Plague Toads along with Foot Surtha. These Marauder Horse Masters also eating the volleys from the Exalted Plague Bearers. This is a little bit rough, but they're doing just fine for the time being. Cold Voider is going to pull up and away, try and get around for a cycle charge. More magical armor-piercing Death's Heads being thrown in here, and Skinwolves do rely almost entirely on their physical resistance for defensive stats. Nice Breath Attack, though, does come in and do some really good damage to those Knights of Nurgle, and then here comes the Voider again for a charge. Just straight up the pipe into the face of Festus. And thankfully the Cold Voider really isn't taking much damage at all. It does have pretty good defense. 51 defense for a flying type monster is definitely decent, considering that a lot of Nurgle units don't have the best attack. I mean, we're looking at like 40 attack and under for most of these units. They're not going to have a great chance to hit, so Cold Voider should take relatively little damage, all things considered. I don't think, yeah, Chilling Aura is just speed. I believe Frostbite is just speed as well, 30% on both, so minus 60% speed on units, which are already relatively slow. Definitely pretty painful for Nurgle, but starting to lose out on some units. The Skinwolves do get terrified away by the Soul Grinder there, but Horse Masters are able to come back, start to clean up some of these peripheral units as the Demon units crumble away. The Nurgle forces will start to get super thin on the ground. We've got more horsemen also coming back from routes, so the mobility engagement has been won by Norsca, as you would expect, and as I look away, Festus gets isolated. I'm not sure. A Soul Grinder, I guess, overchased on the Skinwolves there, and that leads to Festus getting absolutely gooned by the Cold Voider. So very cool to see, actually. I forgot this thing existed, and I definitely forgot that they added it to the Norskins multiplayer roster. We'll talk more about what else they should add to the Norskin's multiplayer roster in just a minute after the battle's done, but for the time being, the Void are going to literally eat Festus and just try and see him off the battlefield there. Meanwhile, the Skin Wolves come back. They're going to get into the Knights. Knights' armor will help them defend from the Skin Wolves' attacks to a large degree, and just the fact they have poison and very high defense also, melee defense-wise. But the Brutes of the Hound and these other Marauders getting through. Also, the Marauder Chieftain, even though he is not great, hasn't really been contested by any high-tier units. Like Festus or the Soul Grinder didn't actually come try and kill him, and I think, in general, I would say this Nurgle build kind of lacks a lot of killing power. I think they were over-relying on the ranged attack of the Soul Grinder, which is just not realistic in land battles against Norsca. Norsca's a very fast faction in general, not to mention the speed debuffs. Nurgle's generally a very slow faction, so I would say you're kind of, yeah, you're not going to be able to use ranged units very effectively. Even monstrous ranged units, they're still just going to get largely occupied. And like the Soul Grinder, even though it hasn't died, obviously, it's continued to get healing, managed to sustain through a lot of damage. It's hasn't been able to use its ranged attack enough to really pay for itself. Maybe. I mean, let's see. Let's take a look at the damage value here. Yeah, 1398. We're not quite there yet. Perhaps if it had been able to fire more, it would have been better, but I think the Knights also, as much as I love the pick, they're relatively slow, and against a fast faction like Norsca, they're very likely to get just dragged down by numbers and javelins and whatnot, so I might have switched the Knights out just straight up for Chariots, actually. The Nurgle Chariots are decent. One of the few kind of fast, high-charge units, relatively speaking, that Nurgle can bring to the table. Marauder Horsemasters with their spears out. Nice downhill charge right into the back of these Exalted Plague Bearers here. As the Brutes of the Hound fight them from the front, we're going to get some Nurgle Knights charging back over. And again, the Nurgle Knights, because of the speed debuff, they're tricky to use effectively. And I think the speed actually does affect their charge damage significantly as well, which, I mean, it would with the Chariot also, but we'll look at that again in just a minute. But anyway, Cold Void are going to charge down once again for a 1v1 versus the Soul Grinder. I suppose if the Soul Grinder actually wins this and is able to get like a big chain terror route on the Norskins, that could be a big problem, but nice Flaming Sword of Ruin here. Give a little damage spike due to Kindle Flame. So despite the poison and the wounds kind of debuffing the weapon strength of the Cold Voider here, hopefully it'll be able to get some extra damage in. Nice supporting Skin Wolf charge here as well, and as the Nurgle units start to run thin on the ground, Soul Grinder will largely get isolated, and the Voider here can try and finish things off. Great cycle charging by Koops, I have to say, as a patron. Nice to see him using that dragon effectively, back up in the air, and then just immediately back down onto the ground. Some great screening as well in this game with the Skin Wolves and these other units, just making sure that the dragon can continue to cycle charge. It is going to come down largely to the Nurgle Knights and the Soul Grinder versus the Marauder Horsemen and the Voider, which is pretty cool, actually. Sort of the light cavalry Frostworm versus the heavy cavalry Soul Grinder. The heavy cavalry is definitely very effective here, don't get me wrong. High leadership, great armor, poison and everything, but they're just going to get bogged down. Thamir comes in to sunder some of that great armor, and even though the Marauder Horsemen are quite small in comparison, they still are definitely enough to contest. We've got the Champs in here as well with their 80 armor. They're quite healthy still. We'll be able to grind with the Nurgle Knights, no problem. Cold Voider, too, taking relatively few hits. Again, only 44 attack on that Soul Grinder. 51 defense on the Cold Voider, which means it's probably about 30% hit chance. Really not great, to be honest, for the Soul Grinder. Super, super cool, and an unusual matchup, too. Not one that I really theory crafted too much in, to be honest. But it's interesting to see how well the Cold Voider actually did in this matchup. Now, granted, he didn't have to face a really big, scary, like, Kugath or something, but I think Kugath actually isn't a problem for Norsca, because you can just take javelins and kill him fairly easily, actually. So, it's an interesting one. Let me know what you guys think about this matchup in the comments down below. Norsca versus Nurgle. It's definitely a fun one for sure, and I really enjoyed this replay. I'd love to see me some hot, rather cold Frostworm action. There you go. One of the worst lords in the game, also prevailing over one of the best, but the real MVP here is the unit that I forgot existed, the Cold Voider. Very good stuff, and I have to use the regular Froststorm a little bit as well to kind of see where its relative power level is at, but it seems like overall most dragon units I've seen and played with myself in practice, in land battles especially, are quite effective, so definitely something to watch out for, but something you might not have considered too much in Norsca's arsenal prior to this, but it's definitely something to consider now. Norsca's elite infantry does a great job trading with the support as well. Skinwolves also do end up coming out cost effectively. They were kind of thrown into some rough situations there, but Skirmish Cav also quite strong, obviously. And those Icehorn Marauders, though, definitely paid a hefty price. Soul Grinder does end up being cost-effective at the end of the day. It's a little bit tricky, certain SCMs against Norsca, just because they're such a Monster Hunter faction. But, I mean, maybe the Plague Mortar is enough to warrant this guy's inclusion. The Knights also, like, pretty close to what you would want out of them. Same thing with the Plague Bears. They're relatively cost-effective. I guess, really, the letdown was mostly from Toads, from Festus, of course, not getting hardly any value. I think he was on healing mode the whole time, but I don't know. I mean, he got sniped so hard by the Cold Voider. I don't know if either that or the Mortis would have helped all that much at the end of the day. But it's an interesting one, certainly. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed watching this. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like, subscribe, hit that bell notification. Every time I upload a new video, you'll be notified. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.